Dear John, I'm in Melbourne. Today I visited Swallow and Aerial Biscuit Factory. I'd say it's one of the sights of Victoria, or should I say, Australia, which no visitor should neglect to visit. Regards from your brother, Harold. In Port Melbourne was the largest distillery, sugar factory and treacle refinery in the state, rice and meal mills, an extensive biscuit factory, boat and carriage building establishments, soap, candle and chemical works.
For over 150 years, Port Melbourne has been a significant centre of manufacturing in Victoria. How so many large industries came to be established in Port Melbourne can be attributed partly to the 1850s gold rush. This created a great demand for consumer goods for the hugely expanding population. The Yarra River at that time was difficult to navigate. Only small vessels could get up the river, meaning goods had to be unloaded and reloaded, which was inefficient and expensive. It was easier to transport goods overland from Port Melbourne to the growing city of Melbourne. Soon, prominent Melbourne businessmen lobbied for a railway to connect Port Melbourne with the city. An integrated railway line opened in September 1854. Thomas Swallow and John Kitchen were migrants who arrived in Melbourne around this time. They became very successful, establishing businesses which traded continuously for over 150 years in Port Melbourne. Thomas Swallow, with business partner Thomas Aerial, established the Swallow and Aerial Biscuit Factory in 1854. Within 30 years, it was famous for its advanced steam technology and was the 5th largest biscuit manufacturer in the world. Raw ingredients arrived by ship and rail from company-owned farms, flour mills and cane fields. According to contemporary reports, the factory made a dazzling array of biscuit styles and presentations. In 1900, during the Boer War, it employed 1,900 people. The factory also produced cakes, ice cream and preserved fruit. Swallow and Aerial only closed in 1987. But it was just one of a number of factories located close to the piers and the railway, which brought in the raw materials such as sugar and distributed the finished products. Robert Harper and Company manufactured starch and a wide range of food products, including breakfast cereals and oatmeal, lentils, desserts and spices. Their labels were printed by Trodell and Cooper, also in Port Melbourne. References to Port Melbourne's industries often included the words largest, biggest, and in the following example, colossal. The Joshua Brothers Distillery made spirits such as whiskey, brandy, rum and gin. In 1889, the factory had the capacity to turn out spirits at the rate of 300,000 gallons a year with a single shift of workmen, which equals nearly 1.4 million litres. This report went on to say, "It can now make sufficient spirits for the consumption of all Victorians," and anticipated being able to meet all of Australia's spirits requirements. Many other industries located on or near the Yarra to take advantage of the water and the proximity of other industries. Kitchen and Son used byproducts from nearby abattoirs to make soap and candles, becoming the largest producer in Australia by 1914. Their factory only ceased operation in 2013. Port Melbourne's many industries were characterised by smoking chimneys and smells in the air, both pleasant and unpleasant. Depending on which way the wind was blowing, it was either the smell of boiling animal fat at kitchens, or biscuit baking at Swallow and Ariel. Fisherman's Bend was identified as an ideal place for the next phase of industrial expansion in the 1930s. It was close to the river wharves for export products and the import of raw materials. General Motors Holden, known locally as GMH, constructed their factory off Salmon Street in 1936 and began assembling cars. Supporting the Allied war effort in the Second World War led to tremendous acceleration in manufacturing. During the war, munitions and armoured vehicles were made in Fisherman's Bend. Following the war, work began on the creation of the first Australian car, the Holden 48 215. But GMH was not the only car industry. Balm Paints located themselves near the car factories to produce paint for the auto industry. Malcolm Moore's factories extended over 6 acres on Williamstown Road and specialised in the design and manufacture of material handling plant and equipment. Several steel castings factories, such as Harman Steel Castings, designed and manufactured the parts needed for heavy machinery. Labour for these rapidly expanding industries came from migrants arriving at Station Pier after the war. Many settled in Port Melbourne. Other British migrants went straight from the migrant hostel in Fisherman's Bend and walked across the sand dunes to work at Holden. The Australian aircraft industry was also well represented in Port Melbourne. There were 2 aircraft factories side by side, the Commonwealth and the government aircraft factories. The first plane, manufactured at Fisherman's Bend, was the Wirraway. Parts are still made for Boeing at Fisherman's Bend. Port Melbourne is also associated with a very substantial food industry. Vegemite is still made in the factory off Salmon Street. From the 1960s onwards, manufacturing in Port Melbourne started a long, slow decline. By the 1980s, many industries had closed down or relocated to cheaper premises away from Port Melbourne. The buildings they had occupied fell into disrepair or were converted to housing. In the late 1980s, a cluster of film-related industries emerged in Rouse Street, Port Melbourne. The Melbourne Film Studio is associated with the filmmakers Nadia Tass and David Parker, where several films and television series have been made. New high-tech industries are emerging in Fisherman's Bend, which combine cloud computing. A notable example is Next DC, which has also invested in the largest solar array on a factory in Melbourne. In 2012, a new vision for the future for Fisherman's Bend was announced by the Minister for Planning, Matthew Guy. Both Holden and Toyota have decided to cease manufacturing cars in Australia from 2017. Port Melbourne's long association with large-scale manufacturing is coming to an end.